I'm Ying-Ying. I'm a Game Studies lecturer at Staffordshire University, and I teach a number of modules on the BA and MA Esports course. I have a sociology background, and my interest is in video game cultures, play, communities, esports and gender studies, and my current work is looking at esports grassroots communities. And today's session will be exploring the representation of male and female gamers and competitive gaming communities. So this work does expand from my PhD, where the aim was to explore the motives and forms of video games related practices at video game events. For my PhD, I went to various events, as you can see from the presentation slide. It was over 30 events between 2012 to 2016. That's when I kind of did my PhD. And you may recognise some of those events on there. For hands up for MCM Comic Con. Yay! So Insomnia Gaming Festival. Ooh, yay. EGX. Or Eurogaming. Yeah, so some of the ones that you might have seen. So the idea was to look at why people went to these events, what do they do, and it was highly ethnographic. I went to the events during the time period. I did surveys, I did interviews, I did focus groups, and I also did a lot of observational research. So that being said, with my PhD research, I also looked at gender as part of it, not initially, but I looked at the representation on who went to these events as well. So that's where it expanded from. And for those people interested, you can read my PhD. It is on the Salford University website. Unfortunately, when I wrote my PhD up, I was told to write it in chapters to send off to my supervisor. And so when I uploaded it in separate chapters as well, which is super annoying, that people already told me. So if you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll give you the whole PDF in one file rather than all in separate chapters. But anyways, what is competitive gaming? Even though video games have existed for almost, since the 1950s, it is important to highlight that the history of video games is filled with tournaments and competition, where it was originally about competitive scene, which was more focused on high scores against computer, which then developed the association with what we know as esports today. And so with esports, it was more about multiplayer modes between area local network LANs or LAN events, and also playing together and online. When we look at the history of video games in particular. And when we look at competitive gaming, we've got to consider what is the definition of video games. And so with video games, it can be referred to all types of electronic gaming, played on gaming consoles, arcade machines, computers, mobile phones, and other gaming hardware. So competitive gaming is really referring to people that play against each other or against computer, or is about winning something or establishing superiority over other people. But what is esports? This is a common question that people often ask. Your parents might not know. I don't know. Some of them don't. My dad didn't. I had to explain it to him. But with esports, it is competitive video gaming where people play against each other online. Usually, at spectator events, indoor arenas, and usually for a cash prize. You can have different formats, 1v1, 3v3, 4v4, 5v5, and of course 6v6 because of Overwatch. This is where a lot of esport arenas kind of went, I need more than 10 PCs now, for the extra 2 when Overwatch came out, which was very interesting to see, and seeing how arenas are being developed and how many they need for setups as well. That being said, it is important to note that esports is a subset of gaming. There's a lot of money involved in esports. We can see it growing every single year. We can see a lot of events taking over other venues. I've run events myself. I've run tournaments in pubs, for anyone who's taken part in pubs in a church, which was a very interesting experience, in exhibition halls, and all sorts of arenas where we are hijacking other venues to make and create, into an esports event. And only recently we are starting to see esport-built arenas rising, as well as specialised esports venues as well, which is becoming more and more interesting as we develop and go forward. For instance, what counts as esports and what is popular. We often see a lot of games on, esport game tier lists on what's popular, what's not. This is already out of date from January 2017. As you can see, some of the games on there are definitely not in the top tier list. And some of the other games you might know off the top of your head might be up there at the top. For example, what game are we missing currently? Fortnite. Anything else?
Apex.
Sorry, Apex? Yes. So I run this with my students actually, and I ask them, what is wrong with this diagram? 1 is out of date, 2 you can't find Fortnite and other games. What else is wrong with this diagram?
Is it very geared towards a particular type of audience?
You could say that. So as you can see, you've got different tier lists. MAU is monthly annual users, then you've got your annual prize pools, and then monthly hours watched. That's the stat that they generated. Some of the interesting notes I wanted to highlight was Super Smash Brothers. They've not determined which one it is. For example, it could be Melee, it could be Ultimate, we're not too sure. They could guess. And then a lot of other titles are not on there as well. So, where's mobile esports? Where's VR esports? Maybe because it's not on that tier list, but it'd be interesting to see what was excluded out of that tier list as well as what is included. So a nice task that I sometimes set my students to do is to recreate the diagram of a current up-to-date one, or to look at one from one particular genre. That focus is better rather than such a general diagram, which I will be talking about when I look at a bit more about data later on. But if you fancy like a nice activity to do in the afternoon, you can make your own esports ecosystem diagram. Games tier list, for fun. And with esports, not every game is an esport. Every game can be competitive. There is some level of competition involved, but as Coben highlights there, the game needs to be competitive. Otherwise, there's no form of competition. We have seen a lot of rules in certain games, such as Smash Brothers Melee, where they focus on very particular rules to be competitive. It has to have a large player base. This is important because if the game's not good and there's no one playing it, it's not really an esport. And it should be well funded as well. Saying that though, it is important to note that there are some exceptions, which are some examples where even though if you inject a lot of money into it, it's not going to become an esport. For example, Artifact, anyone? Yes, and so Artifact was one tournament, or is a card-based game where they injected a lot of money into it for prize pools, but sadly, although they had over, I believe it was bear me one moment, they peaked at 60,000 concurrent players in the first month of release, but this dropped significantly by 75%, within a few weeks, which is a lot of people dipping out, even though there was a lot of money. There were a lot of Reddit posts that said, with the prize money of 100,000, you can give every player £1,000 instead of running the tournament. That's how little people they had left. And so, again, it can happen, and it has happened. What is determined as esports and what isn't. But at the same time, if you have money injected in, it doesn't sometimes work. And also, there have been people that say, I'm going to make an esports game. It's not necessarily, it doesn't work that way. You can't make an esports game. It's the community and the players, and the game itself that makes it an esport, not the designers themselves. With all this being said, it is important to note that esports is ever-changing, and the industry is still in its infancy because it changes so rapidly over time. For instance, there have been some articles by Greenhill and Horton which suggests that esports research is still in its infancy as well. This is just a diagram that I made where you start to see academic esports conferences more and more often. For example, the other week I went to UCI to present at the esports conference, which is running for the second time this year. And there's been a lot of other conferences that now have an esports category or call for papers. So we're starting to see it more and more often. There are also organisations promoting diversity and participation in esports. There's organisations working on local schools and colleges to promote the use of technology through esports and younger audiences, and that one is Digital Schoolhouse, for example, in the UK, what we have currently. We have Women in Games as well, and we also are seeing a sort of trend looking at esports scholarships, as well as universities now having esports degrees. And so what's important to note here is that even though that there is an increasing awareness in esports, according to YouGov, back in a couple of years ago, only 35% of people are aware of esports. But I do know that that figure, well, I'd like to hope that figure has changed, especially after the big event that happened this summer. And what was it? Someone did mention it before. What happened a couple of months back that put esports?
Oh, the Fortnite.
Yeah, the Fortnite World Cup. So a lot of people have put esports on the map, and they tailored it in a really nice way in the media, where they were focusing on the father and son perspective of games, and they try to highlight it more and more from that angle within the media. And so I found that really nice and really positive, and we do see a lot of that related to how the media is represented, looking at moral panics. When it comes to games, we often see, last year we had the big news of games being, a disorder, and this year we're seeing esports in a positive perspective. And so we're seeing a little difference when it comes to games and esports, even though esports is a subset of gaming. And so, again, there's that happening. But despite the increasing awareness of esports, Aniki, which I've got on there as well, suggests that stereotypes, outdated models, and an overall lack of data remain a persistent issue when we think about participation in esports. To date, there is little research exploring the representation of male and female gamers in competitive gaming, including age, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, class, disability, and technicity. Hence, it will be useful to consider the early discussions exploring the relationship between gender and video games and how this has transitioned to issues in competitive gaming communities. For instance, where are all the female gamers is a very common question that I get asked when attending events, at conferences, and amongst a lot of gamers. And so many people have asked this repetitively. So before we begin, it is important to highlight that the representation of male and female gamers in video games have been a major area of discussion since the early 2000s. There have been work on this, with multiple, as you can see, readings, if anyone would like to read. I do promote reading to students. But it is important to note that there are a number of important papers and studies that were published on the subject. Although this subject has received less attention over the last decade, this does not necessarily mean that the situation has improved. In relation to competitive gaming, the focus on the fundamental question, why are there still so few women competing in esports tournaments, when we've seen a steady increase in the number of women playing these games competitively at home, remains debated amongst those involved in competitive gaming. For instance, when we look at gaming as a leisure form, we have seen a rise to the percentage of women playing video games, and both men and women have slightly different genre preferences, such as shooters and puzzle games. Although stats provide a lovely visual representation, statistics can be considered as a powerful weapon because numbers appear to carry weight and of authority and objectivity. For instance, Gary Crawford argues that the numbers can be presented in a variety of ways. Some stats can be excluded, while others are emphasized, and of course, who is asked what questions, as well as numerous other factors, can be radically shaped any given statistic. It is important to understand that not only the origin of the figures, such as how they were collected, who were the samples and so forth, but also the agenda of those presenting them. This suggests that stats are commonly collected from the industry, which invaluably use data to present their business and customers in a positive light. Hence, the findings often focus on headline-grabbing stats to convey a very particular image of video gaming as a normal, social, and healthy pursuit. Also, very little information is usually provided on how the data sets are collected and analysed, In particular, the original sources of secondary data are often poorly referenced, making it following up with the research difficult. But it is not to say that these kinds of findings should be simply mistreated or mistrusted. They have some value in them. For instance, what I've got here, these are some of the data, esports data in gaming that you may come across before. So I've got Newzoo, YouGov, and Nielsen reports. And this is much information I tried to extract from each report. And so their sample sizes, which countries they looked at, their research methods, and then what findings they have. Just a brief overview on what I found. But as you can see, again, where they post up their data or how they represent it, or in particular how the questionnaire, if they've got online interviews, what kind of questions they had, that gets all, we don't see any of that. And at the same time, what's interesting to note is that I have come across some reports that suggested so and so number of people play video games, this percentage male, this percentage female, is on the games report, but yet the report did show that less than 20% play video games. And so again, it was really interesting to find out where that starts from and why that is even valuable in any way. But again, it depends on how data is represented and how you write out the data or interpret the data as well. That's something worth noting and worth highlighting. So what have I got here? With that being said, a lot of the reports, as you can see, I like to look at the findings. Number one, from Newzoo, they say 46% of gamers are women, whereas YouGov, they state that 76% of males and 24% of females watch esports, and then Nielsen suggests that 71% of esports fans are male. And so with these stats, what's interesting is to note that when we look at more general gaming reports, we usually see a more balanced ratio. But when we look at esports and start looking at competitively, we see a massive drop in comparison to the ratio of being balanced to more male dominated. And that's just something worth noting that's happening. But it is important to highlight that this is sometimes how the data is recorded. They are mainly looking at players or fans, people that are mostly visible doing something in particular, which I will be talking about later in a bit. That's just another stat because as you can see, some stats also highlight on different genres of games, as you can see where there's which ones are more male dominated than the other ones. But anyways, when considering gender, it's important to note that from a female perspective, Hayward suggests that leisure reflects a man-made view of the world, where women's leisure experiences have often been ignored. In relation to video games, the lack of female participation in video games has often been recognised as a social problem, where modern technology has often been argued to be male-dominated. Castle and Jenkins suggest that the lack of female engagement in video games is deeply rooted to the construction of gender through the understanding of gender differences in cultural norms which often operate with an internal and external system of constraints. This suggests that the gender representations in video gaming are legitimated through culture, where it is used to maintain the existing status quo and promote dominant values. In particular, in early feminist writers, they differentiate between sex and gender, where the roles of being male and female are determined through biological and cultural aspects in everyday life. Within the binary framework, sex refers to the biological body and differences between male and female, which are based on 6 major components: chromosome makeup, reproductive organs, hormonal status, internal and external genitals, and sexual and secondary sex characteristics. Whereas gender refers to social construction of appropriate roles and cultural understandings that are attached to male and female bodies, such as masculinity being referred to a set of social practices and cultural representations associated to being a man, and femininity a set of practices associated to being female. Conceptually separating sex and gender is politically significant for feminists, as it rejects the biological determination, making gender roles socially and culturally defined, which talks about the sex the social learning theory rather than naturally constructed, which also looks at the sex role theory that I'll be looking at. So within the sex role theory, this highlights that men and women have different biological determined roles within the literature of video games due to natural differences. The behaviour of male and females are biologically determined, where females will have feminine attributes and interests, while males will have masculine ones. These social meanings are deeply rooted within culture and cause gender polarisation, which is incorporated through patriarchal gender roles represented in society. This suggests that many forms of leisure activities are gender marked and based on the gender differences in everyday life. However, constraining oneself to patriarchal gender roles prevents change, negotiation, and resistance. And what's important to note here that in contrast, the counter-argument, the social learning theory argues that gender product of culture and society is not biological. Instead, it looks at individuals that learn gender-appropriate roles from birth through socialization, from cultural role and environmental aspects of everyday life through different forms of social institutions. In relation to video games, Castle and Jenkins highlight that the lack of female engagement in video games is deeply rooted within the understandings of gender differences in cultural norms through the social construction of gender. However, it has been suggested that cultural messages differ over time and place, therefore masculinity and femininity become diverse. For instance, Judith Butler highlights that the gender is performative, and refusal to conform to hegemonic or traditional performances can create gender trouble. Like language, discourse can create other ways to express masculinity and femininity. However, despite the freedom for both men and women with diverse game choices and play practices, it remains evident that access amongst diverse participation in video gaming continues to be a social issue. For instance, besides video games being argued to be designed by men and for men and about the male gaze, which represent women as sexual objects, female characters being sidekicks or damsels in distress also reinforces gender stereotypes. And this is mostly because when we look at industry, we see a lot of males within industries in games, people designing games, people writing about games. For instance, the work by Alicia Copeland, her work, she presented her work at British Digger in 2018, where she analysed the language of games using transcripts. And so this was 768,000 words from Dragon Age origin. And what was interesting was to use this linguistic analysis, looking through all the transcripts, finding out themes and patterns, then counting the number of times that things show up, and then looking for links. One of the findings that she mentioned in the presentation was that men within the male characters were often associated to be strong. And interestingly, the female characters would mention about shoes in the whole thing, quite a lot of times. Again, which is an interesting finding to see how gender stereotypes are reinforced. However, it is important to note that there has been an emergence, of leading female characters and gender-neutral games as well, which I won't be talking too much about. But that's what is happening within the game industry. They do notice, things. Why aren't females playing games? And so they are trying to look at that as well. However, it is important to note. But when we look at the relationship of women and video gaming within private spaces, because this is what's happening within the public, a lot of research looking at private spaces often focus on the ambivalence around technology, such as forming a core interest and passion in video games, male spaces within households, such as having video games in the bedrooms or living rooms, and unequal domestic labour responsibility and leisure activities as well. Therefore, it is important to highlight that many studies tend to focus on the marginalisation and exclusion of female gamers within private spaces rather than the public spaces. And I've got several examples. For instance, in the public space, there have been a couple of pieces of work where females are presented as exotic or strange, to the exception to the rule that video gaming is usually performed as a male activity and sexualised in a manner which male gamers are not. When women appear in these environments, women are usually expected to fit in a non-gaming role, offering support and engagement rather than being active gamers, or they are often written off as tomboys. Also, women in general are less likely to brag or make themselves heard, especially when in a male-centered environment. And if a woman is good, she is often referred to play like a man. This suggests that when women participate and compete in these spaces, many are still framed in a number of ways by male gamers and appear contrary to expectations of feminine behaviour and interest. I have included a couple more examples. So besides Exotic and Strange, non-gaming support roles as well, looking at tomboys. Research that was done on women and gaming environments were actually booth babes, which have now been banned since 2012 for Eurogamer. And some of the examples on the right was actually from my own PhD. I played Hearthstone competitively, where I've come top 8 twice at Insomnia. And when sat down, we usually play against someone, and then someone would come over and give you a well-played handshake. And someone did come up to me and say, I'm looking for Munchkin. And I goes, that's me. Oh no, I'm looking for your boyfriend, not you. And so that was quite interesting to see and experience. And sometimes when I beat other players, I often get the remark of, she got lucky. And you often have to prove yourself that you were good, which was interesting. And then the other one that I've included at the bottom is land trash. This is from an interview on what they thought about females in these gaming environments. And they said people are usually taken within these gaming environments, or they are land trash. I did ask what land trash was because I didn't know what it was, and I had to find the definition. So this is a definition of socially, a slag who visits a land because of the high male to female ratio, is usually on the lower end of the attractiveness, yet is able to attract virgin nerds like flies, is what the definition is. And so again, it became very interesting. This was at Insomnia, one of the people I interviewed. That's what they said, there's lots of land trash around. And I did think, what's that? Again, very interesting. And when we look at the representation of male and female gamers in public spaces, there's not been many research on there. For example, Jans and Martins looked at Camp Zone 2 in the Netherlands, and from a sample of 1,200, only 30 were female. Again, very low, but that was in 2003. T.L. Taylor in 2010 looked at DreamHack from 2005 and 2009 in Sweden, and from the quote there, we counted about 1 for every 20 seated participants for DreamHack, which puts the total number of women visitors generally at 10 to 15%. And so DreamHack is a LAN event, and that's the figures that she saw. But what T.R. Taylor and Emma Witowski did argue was that women are taking on the role of gatekeepers, for other women taking on the role of the practice players and providing an alternative access point to gaming. For example, in 2016, Genesis 3 hosted the First Ladies crew battle for Super Smash Bros. Melee. This series of women's crew battles are also known as Smash Sisters, an event organised by women for women. This example prompts some worthwhile considerations on access to gaming and game spaces, where entry involves a more complex structural arrangement, including networks, gaming know-hows, and access to technology and games. And besides, obviously, the other 2 research that I showed you, this is actually from my PhD. I did do a pilot study on the number of people that were there and interviews. And from my work, that was a ratio of, not quite a ratio, but just a little dab a lot, the number of people that had compared to male and female. So Eurogamer, again, 15 to 10, MC Comic Con, 8 to 12, Play Expo, again, and so on and so forth. But overall, it was more male-dominated. However, with my research, I did find that more social events, so events that had more activities in, also covering other things such as MC Comic Con. It's not just about games, it's about comic books, anime, and all sorts. There were more females, engagement in comparison to more gaming-related events. And so that was really interesting because with my research, it was more about looking at gaming-related practices and looking at how they socialise and looking at cosplay and much more, which again, cosplay was an activity that was more populated amongst females rather than males in comparison. And so that being said, from my own research, I did find it interesting as a Hearthstone player. I did compete between 2012 to 2014. Out of all the tournaments I competed in, this was face-to-face tournaments and Insomnias, also local Manchester tournaments that I also competed in, and some online tournaments. I came across 5 female Hearthstone players. So there weren't many. It has grown since, but with a relatively new game at the time, there weren't many female players within the UK scene. In particular. But what I have been noticing is that there have been an increase, and there have been many opportunities to create, many opportunities created by certain organisations looking at women-only tournaments. And so what we've got here is that I've got several examples where certain communities were looking at women-only tournaments with women gaming spaces to normalise the notion of women competing. For example, again, the Smash Sisters are a series of women crew battles that feature Smash Brothers from Aniki. We've got the Girl Gamer Esports Festival. We've got WEG's Women's Only Tournament for certain titles for CSGO and Hearthstone. But that one did have a smaller prize pool for women in particular. For example, the Hearthstone tournament, for that one, for the normal standard tournament, it was 190k, but with the women-only tournament, that was only 35k. When I did compete, I did even question with myself, should I play, for a bigger prize pool, or should I go for the smaller prize pool? It's like playing a scratch card, when you buy the number of value to your chance of playing, and that's how most people kind of felt. Because when I asked the other competitors why they chose from different tournaments, especially the women that competed in the women-only tournaments, some of them did mention that they competed because they knew there weren't going to be many people, therefore the chances of winning was more than in comparison to the more general one. So again, that was an interesting comment from one of the players. And besides that, there have been continuous debates where the women-only tournaments can be justified, such as the Hearthstone Invitational, Women's Invitational in 2015. So that's the bottom example there. So in 2015, IMBA TV consisted of 8 women wearing white dresses, with stage decorations consisting of rainbow cardback wall designs, purple drapes, flowers projected on the floor, and uncomfortable stools at high tables. This was really interesting because the sponsor was DX Racer, a chair manufacturer. And so that's why I've got the little comment at the end, oh, these chairs are so comfortable. I've seen other memes from it where, I'm glad we didn't give it to the girls. And they were the casters. But anyways, besides that, although it may seem that video games are made for men and by men, it is important to recognise that video game studies has often focused on the isolation of video games, or the textual analysis of video games themselves. These studies have often been too closely aligned with a very narrow understanding of direct play, which often ignore the social aspect of video gaming away from the screen. So Newman argues that it is important to consider not just the act of playing a video game, but also how people play with video games, such as the various video game related practices that take place away from the screen. These can include talking about video games, creating video game stories, and things that make and do, such as fan art, music, cosplay, game guides and walkthroughs, FAQs, speedruns, mods, and hacks. This suggests that playing with video games can involve various video game related practices suffused with talk, sharing, and collaboration through social interaction, which can provide a pathway to various opportunities and communities. So rather than focusing on the gender representation of playing video games, it is important to consider gender representations of various video game related practices too, such as I mentioned before, cosplay, which is primarily dominated by women. And in relation to fan studies, Horton and Weil highlights that fan creative content is often interpreted as a consequence of the mass culture needing to compensate for lack of intimacy, community and identity. Similar forms of creative content can also be outlined within various video game related practices such as modders, hackers, walkthroughs, writers and so on and so forth that may be more popular amongst either males or females. For example, slash culture. Slash culture is I don't know, do I need to explain what slash culture is? Slash culture is popular amongst women, and this is the production of images and stories based on popular media characters which often feature male-on-male romances and sexual images, also known as yaoi. And Penley's in 2017 example on slash culture suggests that despite the limitations of participation within video games among women, these women can participate with video games in other ways. And so, for instance, Paul suggests that the game for women is within the chat rooms, where the percentage of connected people, women dominate the conversations of the internet. This suggests that the study of video games needs to be applied within a wider social context where gender participation may differ when compared to various video game related practices. Although there are many patriarchal theories embedded within culture, it is also incorporated within other social factors where video games reflects gender patriarchal roles in society through all of its processes, including marketing, game themes, gender representations in gaming characters, game spaces and participation, and it is essential to examine these further, such as gender demographics explored in recent global games and esports reports. And that being said, when we look at esports, it is important to note that it's not just about the top 1%. When people look at esports, they do focus just on the top players and professional players because they are the most visible. And when it comes to esports, again, we have an esports ecosystem, and it's not just about the players, but everyone around it that supports the whole scene. And so you've got your game developers, your publishers, the other players besides the professional players, because being 1% is very generous. It's actually 0.01 to be at the very top. And so one of the things that I often tell my students is that, you know, you're not all going to be professional gamers. This is why you're here. You know, throw that dream away and look at being at the other roles that highlight all around of esports. You know, event organisers, spectators and fans and interviewers. These are the things that make competitive tournaments and competition with high stakes happen. So while the esports industry has been fast moving and professional gamers retiring at early ages, mid-20s, in the esports scene, it is continuously changing with new games, players, spectators, commentators and organisers drifting in and out of the esports scene. Therefore, due to the inconsistency for change, negotiating and resistance within competitive gaming communities and culture, where gender stereotypes are continuing to be exercised, the patriarchal theories embedded within culture will take time to change. For instance, T.L. Taylor states that the gender diversion of competition is often seen simply as a stopgap, simply as a stopgap measure until women are structurally supported and skilled up enough to be able to compete against men. Though how this big leap will happen is typically little throughout. This suggests issues with equal opportunities for accessing career paths in esports for both men and women. Therefore, a better support structure may be to provide more competitive community-based practices, such as social gatherings and amateur brackets, to create more opportunities to compete against each other with various levels of skill to grow and maintain competitive gaming communities and build tight-knit bonds amongst community members, and not just about the top level players, but also the middle and lower tier players to reduce the skill gap. For instance, Heir to the Throne, which is the picture I've got there with the top-up tent. This was held a couple of years ago, and they had a slogan which is 2-0 is not an option, which considers standardized commercial tournament rules to be problematic for knocking players out after 2 rounds. In contrast, guarantees 8 sets of games for every player, promoting a sense of community and leveled relations between players and of all experience and skill levels. So overall, this just placed importance on understanding the attitudes towards women and women competing in video games and tournaments on the same platform as men to challenge the gender diverse and video game communities within video game culture. But there is also equal importance to consider the attitudes of male gamers and competitive gaming, as well as encouraging a balance between community and competition for competitive gamers, and not just focusing on the professional or the semi-professionals. And so what I've got there is a diagram on how tournaments are structured. When we look at esports, a lot of the time we see tournament structures having pools or groups, and then after that, if you go through, you go to a bracket. Some of the pools are quite harsh, and so you don't get to play with everyone or much. And so more grassroots tournaments are now focusing on a better structure, as you can see from Air, which also happened at another event called Fate. They have 8 players per pool, and then from whatever place you're placed in, if you're first or third, you get put in the gold pools, and then that's another pool that you play with 6 players. So that's already 14 games that you play, and then you get put in a gold bracket, which is a double limb. So it's a great chance and opportunity for you to play other players and get to know the community more. And by having that, you're building a better structure with communities, and a great way to create more opportunities is to actually run better events in particular, and also to run different activities and events. For example, the event that I hosted at my university, we had 320 players. We didn't just have a tournament, it was over 3 days. It was actually over 4 because Thursday was arrival day, and as you can see, the first day was just focusing on community activities, something you don't see often when it comes to gaming events. Insomnia did have it, but they've also changed their structure because it's been brought up by Game. They still have their pub quiz, but it's not so much about the BYC players anymore, which originally was about. A lot of gamers are looking at moving or running their own events now. That's something worth noting. And as I said, it's not just about playing. For example, at Fate, we had friendlies area, we had a pub quiz. That's just a pub quiz activity we had to do. We had to build something Mario related out of Play-Doh in 45 seconds. It was very stressful. It doesn't look great. I'm trying to think which one's mine. The pink blob in the middle was mine. We had a spectating area where the players became the spectators, which was also great for the community. We had the Smash Sisters crew battles, we had international crews, we had five-a-side football. We basically listened to what the community wanted. We also drank the bar dry. The university was very happy with that. And on top of that, all of us were first aid trained. So that's all the organisers, not everyone. We didn't run a first aid course. It would be interesting though if we did do that. But again, it's not. With esports or competitive gaming, it's not just about the top players, but it's also about the people, the forgotten players. The crew members, the volunteers, people that make it happen, and also the community that supports it. That's all I've got.